The Downs by Amyas Northcote and read by Chris Halton. I am venturing to set down the following personal experience, inconclusive as it is, as I feel that it may interest those who have the patience to study the phenomena of the unseen world around us. It was my first experience of a psychical happening, and its events are accordingly indelibly imprinted on my memory. The date was, alas, a good many years ago, when I was still a young man and was engaged in reading hard for a certain examination. My friend Jay was in a similar plight to myself, and together we decided to abjure home and London life and seek a quiet country spot where we might devote ourselves to our work amidst pleasant and congenial surroundings. Jay knew of such a place, a farm belonging to a Mr. Harkness, who was a distant connection of his own by marriage. Mr. Harkness was a childless widower and lived much to himself at Branksome Farm, attended to only by an elderly housekeeper and 1 or 2 servants. Although he called himself a farmer and did in fact farm fairly extensively, he was a man of cultivated and even learned tastes, widely read and deeply versed in the history and folklore of his neighbourhood. At the same time, although good-natured, he was the most reserved and taciturn man I had ever met, and appeared to have a positive horror of communicating his very considerable fund of local knowledge to outsiders like ourselves. However, he was glad to welcome us as paying guests for the sake of his relationship to Jay, and he and his housekeeper certainly took great care to make us comfortable and happy. Branksome Farm is a large old-fashioned house surrounded by the usual farm buildings and situated in a valley winding its way among the downs. The situation is beautiful and remote, and it would astonish many of our city dwellers to know that within 2 or 3 hours' railway journey from London, there still are vast stretches of open downland on which one may walk for hours without sight of a human being, and traversed only by winding roads which run from one small town or hamlet to another, linking a few lonely cottages or farms to civilization on their route. Behind the house, Branksome Down, the highest in the neighbourhood, rises steeply, and beyond it, at a distance of about 3 miles, is Willingbury, the nearest town, whence the railway runs to London. It is necessary to describe the geography of the country between Willingbury and Branksome a little more closely. The two places lie, as is usually the case in the down country, in valleys between the hills, and by road are distant from each other by about 6 to 7 miles, being separated by the long ridge of Branksome Down, but actually the distance between them does not exceed 3 miles across the down. The path from Branksome, a mere sheep track, leading up to the top of Branksome Down, whence the wanderer sees before him a wide shallow dip in the down, nearly circular, about 3/4 of a mile across, and at the other side sloping up to another gentle ridge. Arrived at the summit of this second elevation, the traveller gazes down on the Willingbury-Overbury road, and following another sheep track down the hillside, he reaches the road about a mile outside Willingbury. The whole down is covered with sweet short turf, unbroken by trees or shrubs, and was unmarred by fencing of any form at the time of my story. Flocks of sheep tended by shepherds and their watchful dogs were almost its sole inhabitants, save for the shy wildlife that clings to all natural shelters. Of the beauty of this down, and in fact of the whole neighbourhood, it is useless to speak. To anyone who has once felt the fascination of a walk in the fresh pure air, over the springy and centuries-old turf, and who has allowed his eyes to wander over the miles and miles of open down, studded here and there with rare belts of trees, and has watched the shifting lights play over the near and distant hills, it is needless to speak. And to anyone who has never yet been fortunate enough to find himself in downland. In fine weather one can hardly make its fascination clear in words, and one can only advise him to go and explore its beauties for himself. Well, it was at Branksome Farm that Jay and I took up our abode and commenced a course of steady reading, tempered and varied by long walks about the country. Our time passed pleasantly and profitably, and we discovered one day with regret that more than half of it had elapsed. Dismayed at this discovery, we began to set our wits to work to find an excuse for prolonging our stay at Branksome, when suddenly an event happened which entirely altered our plans. Returning one day from our accustomed walk, Jay found a telegram waiting for him, which called him to London without delay, and the contents of which appeared to indicate the probability of his being unable to return to Branksome. No time was to be lost in making a start if he was to catch the afternoon train at Willingbury, and as it was really quicker to walk across the down than to drive round the roads behind Mr. Harkness's rather slow old mare, he threw a few clothes hastily into a bag and departed for the station. I accompanied him to see him off, and we made the best possible speed to Willingbury. But we had miscalculated the time. The afternoon train had gone, and we found on inquiry that there would be no other until the night mail for London, which passed through Willingbury shortly before 11 p.m. Jay urged me not to wait for this, but to leave him at the little inn and go back to Branksome before dark. But I was anxious to keep him company and cheer up his rather depressed spirits, so finally we agreed to dine together at the Blue Lion and spend the evening there until the train left. I was perfectly confident in my ability to find my way back over the down to Branksome at night, as the path was very familiar to us, and I expected to be aided by the light of the moon, which would rise about 10 o'clock. In due course the train arrived, and having seen Jay safely on his way to London, I turned my steps towards the Willingbury-Overbury Road and its junction with the Branksome sheep track. It was a little after 11 p.m. when I left Willingbury on my homeward way, and I was disappointed to find that the moon had failed me, being completely hidden behind a thick canopy of cloud. The night was profoundly still, as well as being very dark, but I was confident in my powers of finding my way, and I strode contentedly along the road till I reached the point where it was necessary I should diverge onto the down. I found the commencement of the sheep track without difficulty, as my eyes were now accustomed to the surrounding obscurity, and set myself to climbing the down as quickly as possible. I must make it clear that up to the present time I had been in my usual state of health and spirits, although the latter were somewhat depressed at Jay's sudden departure and the break-up of our pleasant association together. Up to this night also I had never in the least suspected that I was possessed of any special psychic intelligence. It is true that I had known that I was in the habit of occasionally dreaming very vividly and consecutively, but I had never given this faculty a serious thought, nor, like most young men in the 20s, had I ever given any consideration to psychic matters. It must be remembered also that I am writing of nearly 40 years ago, when an intelligent interest in the potentialities of unseen beings and kindred topics was far less common than it is today. Well, I commenced my ascent of the hill, and I had not gone very far when I became aware of a certain peculiar change taking place in myself. I fear I shall find it very difficult to describe my sensations in a fashion intelligible to those who have never experienced anything similar, whilst to those who have undergone psychic ordeals, my description will probably appear bald and inadequate. I seem to be, in some mysterious fashion, divided into a dual personality. One, the familiar one, was myself, my body, which continued to walk up the sheep track, keenly alive to the need to keep a sharp lookout against losing my way or stumbling over some obstruction. This personality also felt loneliness and a certain degree of nervousness. The darkness, silence, and immensity of the empty country around me were oppressive. I feared something, I was not quite sure what, and I anxiously wished I was at the end of my journey with the farm lights shining out to welcome me. My other personality was more vague and ill-defined. It seemed to be separated from my body and outer consciousness, and floating in a region where there was neither space nor time. It seemed to be aware of another world, a world surrounding and intermingling with this one, in which all that is or was or will be was but one moment, and in which all places near or far, the down and the remotest of the invisible stars, were but one spot. All was instantaneous, and all was eternal. I am not clear how long this mood lasted, but it was probably only a few minutes before my earthly self was brought, or appeared to be brought, into entire control of my personality by a sudden shock. As I walked, I became aware that I was not alone. There was a man moving parallel with me on my right at the distance of some 4 or 5 yards. So suddenly and so silently had he appeared that he seemed to have risen from the earth. He was walking quite quietly at my own pace abreast of me, but apparently taking no notice of me, and I observed that his footsteps made no sound on the soft turf. The dim light made it difficult to see him at all distinctly, but he was evidently a tall, powerfully built fellow, dressed in a long cloak which, partly covering his face, fell nearly to his feet. On his head he wore a queer-shaped 3-cornered hat, and in his hand he carried what appeared to be a short, heavy bludgeon. I was greatly startled. I am a small and by no means robust man, and the apparition of this odd-looking stranger on these lonely downs was disquieting. What did he want? Had he followed me down the road from Willingbury? And if so, for what purpose? However, I decided it was best not to appear alarmed, and after taking another glance at the man, I wished him good evening. He took not the faintest notice of my salutation, which he appeared not even to have heard, but continued to advance up the hill by my side in dead silence. After a few moments I spoke again, and this time my voice sounded strange in my own ear, as if it had not come from my lips, but from somewhere far away. "A dark night," I said, and now he answered. In a low, measured voice, but one in which there sounded a note of hopelessness and misery, he said, "It is dark to you, it is darker for me." I scarcely knew what to reply, but I felt that my courage was at an ebb, and that I must maintain it by endeavouring to keep up a conversation, difficult though this might prove. Accordingly I went on. "This is a strange place to walk in at night. Have you far to go?" He did not turn his head or look at me. "Your way is short and easy, but mine is long and hard. How long, O Lord, how long?" he cried. As he uttered the last words, his voice rose to a cry, and he tossed his arms above his head, letting them fall to his side with a gesture of despair. We had now almost reached the top of the down, and as we neared the summit, I became aware that the wind was rising. At the moment, we were sheltered from it by the brow of the hill, but I could hear its distant roaring, and as we reached the summit, it broke upon us with a rush. With it and mingled in its sounds came other sounds, the sounds of human voices, of many voices, in many keys. There were sounds of wailing, shouting, chanting, sobbing, and even at times of laughter. The great shallow bowl of Branksome Down was alive with sounds. I could see nothing save my strange companion, who continued to move steadily forward, and I, dreading his company, and yet dreading even more to be left alone, accompanied him. The night was still profoundly dark, and though as I advanced the voices often sounded quite near, I saw nothing until after we had passed the centre of the depression and were mounting the opposite slope. At that moment the wind tore aside the clouds, and the moon streamed down full upon the downs. By her light I saw a marvellous and a terrifying sight. The whole of Branksome Down was alive with people hurrying hither and thither, some busy and absorbed in their occupations, whatever they might be, others roaming aimlessly and tossing their arms into the air with wild and tragic gesticulations. The crowd appeared to be of all sorts and conditions, and to be dressed in the fashions of all the ages, though ancient costumes seemed to predominate. Here I saw a group of persons clothed apparently in the priestly robes of ancient Britain. There walked a soldier wearing the eagle-crested helmet of Rome. Other groups there were in dresses of a later date, the steel-clad knight of the Middle Ages, the picturesque dress and flowing hair of a cavalier of the 17th century. But it was impossible to fix the shifting crowd. As I gazed, absorbed at one figure, it melted and was gone, and another took its place, to fade likewise as I watched. My companion paid no heed to the throng. Steadily he passed on towards the crest of the hill, at intervals raising his arms and letting them fall with his old gesture of despair, and uttering at the same time his mournful cry of, "How long, how long?" We passed onward and upward and reached the top of the down, my companion now a few yards in front of me. As he reached the crest of the hill, he stopped, and lifting his arms above his head, stood motionless. Suddenly he wavered, his figure expanded, its lines became vague and blurred against the background, and it faded and was gone. As it vanished, the wind dropped suddenly, the sound of human voices ceased, and gazing around me, I saw the plain bare and still in the moonlight. I was now at the top of the hill, and looking downwards, I saw a light burning in a window of Branksome Farm. I stumbled down the hill in haste, and as I approached the house, I saw Mr. Harkness standing at the open door. He looked at me strangely as I entered. "Have you come across Branksome Down tonight?" he exclaimed. "Tonight of all the nights in the year?" "Yes," I replied. "I should have warned you," he said, "but I expected you back before dark. Branksome Down is an ill place tonight, and men have vanished upon it before now, and never been heard of again. No shepherd will set foot upon it tonight, for this is the night in the year when, folks say, all those that ever died violent deaths upon the downs come back to seek their lost rest." The end.